The morning light filtered through the office windows as Marcus sat at his desk, watching his colleague Daniel present the quarterly results. Daniel spoke with confidence, his words measured and deliberate, yet within his presentation lay a subtle manipulation of facts that only Marcus seemed to notice. The numbers were technically correct, but the narrative Daniel had woven around them painted a picture far more favorable than reality warranted. Marcus felt the familiar tension rising in his chest, anger at the deception, frustration at the manipulation. He wanted to interrupt, to expose the selective presentation, to assert his dominance in the room. But instead he closed his eyes for a moment, took a measured breath, and asked himself a question that would haunt him for months to come. Should he respond with ruthless strategic cunning or stoic acceptance? This question lies at the heart of one of history's most profound philosophical tensions. On one side stands the Stoic, embodying Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus, seeking peace through acceptance and virtue. On the other stands the Machiavellian, echoing the strategies outlined in Renaissance political philosophy, pursuing power through calculated action and strategic manipulation. Between these two extremes, millions of people navigate the treacherous waters of modern existence, unsure which compass to follow. The question itself contains a paradox that demands exploration. To understand which philosophy should guide a life, one must first understand what each philosophy actually demands, and more importantly, what each philosophy costs. The promise of Stoic calm is tranquility and freedom from external turbulence. The promise of Machiavellian strategy is control, and the achievement of one's objectives regardless of circumstance. But what happens when these two philosophies collide in the heart of a single person trying to survive and flourish in an unforgiving world? The titular statement, "The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others," carries profound implications that cut across both philosophical traditions. It suggests that true power comes not from external domination but from internal transformation. Yet this transformation can be interpreted through either lens. The Stoic reads this as the destruction of irrational desires and fears, the elimination of the ego's desperate grasping. The Machiavellian reads it as the hardening of oneself against sentiment and weakness, the cultivation of a strategic mind impervious to manipulation. Both claim to explain this statement. Both claim to lead to invulnerability. Yet they lead in opposite directions. This exploration requires us to trace the philosophy of both traditions through lived experience, through the choices that real people make when confronted with genuine dilemmas. It requires us to examine what each tradition teaches about power, about virtue, about the self, and about our relationship to the world around us. Only by understanding the depth of each perspective can we hope to answer which should guide a life, or whether perhaps the answer lies in a territory neither philosophy fully acknowledges. Part 1. The Architecture of Two Worldviews. The Stoic enters the world with a fundamental conviction. There exists a cosmic order, a rational principle governing all existence. This principle, whether called logos by the ancient Stoics, divine reason, or simply the laws of nature, operates with perfect justice and wisdom. Within this framework, Stoicism divides all things into two categories with almost mathematical precision. Some things are within our control: our judgments, our desires, our aversions, our intentions. Everything else, our body, our wealth, our reputation, our status, lies outside our control. This binary division transforms how the Stoic approaches every challenge and opportunity. Epictetus, himself born into slavery, crystallized this philosophy in a simple declaration. It is not things themselves that trouble us, but our judgments about things. A person can take away Epictetus's leg, he taught, but they cannot take away his freedom, because his freedom exists in the realm of his faculty of choice. External circumstances become almost irrelevant to the Stoic's well-being. What matters is how one responds, what one chooses to believe, and whether one's choices align with virtue, with wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance. The Stoic sage, the ideal toward which Stoicism points, is not the person with the most possessions or the greatest authority. The Stoic sage is the person who has achieved correct judgment about what truly matters and what does not. This sage can be poor without suffering, enslaved without being humiliated, ill without despair, facing death without fear. The Stoic sage achieves what might be called invulnerability through the radical reorientation of what they consider worth pursuing and worth protecting. Consider Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, who ruled the most powerful empire in the world, yet his personal journals, his meditations, reveal a man constantly reminding himself that his imperial power meant nothing in the grand scheme of the cosmos. He admonishes himself for taking pride in his station, for becoming attached to the pleasures of his position, for allowing external circumstances to disturb his equanimity. He was a man with every possible external advantage, yet he considered it vital to his well-being to constantly diminish in his mind the importance of what others envied most about him. The Machiavellian, by contrast, enters the world with a different fundamental conviction. While the Stoic sees cosmic order and divine reason, the Machiavellian sees power as the fundamental reality. Niccolo Machiavelli, writing in Renaissance Italy during a time of constant war and political upheaval, built his philosophy on observation rather than idealism. He studied what works, not what should work according to moral philosophy. He examined how men actually behave, not how they ought to behave. And in this examination, he reached a startling conclusion. The person who relies on virtue, honesty, and keeping their word in a world where others do not will be destroyed. The Machiavellian worldview divides the world differently than Stoicism does. Rather than dividing things into what is within our control and what is not, the Machiavellian asks a more pragmatic question: what produces the desired outcome? This worldview recognizes that human beings are driven by passion, fear, and self-interest. They respond to power, to the threat of punishment, to the promise of reward. Virtue, in Machiavelli's analysis, is useful only insofar as it produces results. A leader who appears virtuous but acts ruthlessly when necessary will survive longer than a leader who is genuinely virtuous but bound by moral constraints. The Machiavellian does not dismiss the concept of control that Stoicism emphasizes, but interprets it differently. Yes, much of what happens in the world lies beyond any individual's control. But the Machiavellian insists that through strategic thinking, through careful observation of human nature, and through decisive action, one can dramatically increase the portion of one's environment that comes under one's control. One cannot control whether others betray you, but one can structure your relationships so that betrayal becomes costly or difficult. One cannot control economic conditions, but one can position yourself to benefit from whatever conditions arise. Where the Stoic achieves invulnerability through the reorientation of desire, by ceasing to want things that can be taken away, the Machiavellian achieves it through the cultivation of power. The Stoic says, "I am invulnerable because nothing external can truly harm me." The Machiavellian says, "I am invulnerable because I am too powerful to be harmed." These two worldviews lead to radically different prescriptions for how to live. The Stoic advocates for a reduction of desires, a focus on virtue, a cultivation of equanimity in the face of all circumstances. The Stoic's advice is fundamentally conservative. Want less, accept what comes. Focus only on what is within your control. The Machiavellian advocates for the expansion of power, the strategic manipulation of circumstances and people, the ruthless pursuit of objectives. The Machiavellian's advice is fundamentally activist. Want more, shape what comes, expand what falls under your control. Yet both claim to lead toward the same destination. A life that cannot be destroyed by external circumstances. Both claim to produce freedom. Both claim to produce security. The Stoic achieves it by no longer caring about security in the external world. The Machiavellian achieves it by dominating the external world. In this lies the profound tension. To understand which philosophy should guide a life, one must examine what each actually produces in practice. The Stoic philosophy, when genuinely practiced, does produce a remarkable equanimity. The person who has truly internalized that external circumstances are not his business, that his only business is his faculty of choice and his virtue, does achieve a kind of freedom. They experience a lightness that those trapped in endless desire and anxiety cannot access. History provides examples. Marcus Aurelius continued to govern competently despite his profound indifference to the trappings of power. Epictetus maintained dignity and taught philosophy from slavery. Countless unnamed Stoics have faced hardship, illness, and death without losing their composure. But this comes at a cost that is rarely explicitly acknowledged. The Stoic achieves freedom from external turbulence by creating internal distance from the external world. The Stoic lover must constantly remind himself that his loved ones are mortal, that losing them is possible, and that this loss, while sad, is not truly an evil. The Stoic worker must remind herself that her career ambitions, while perhaps worth pursuing, are fundamentally insignificant. The Stoic activist pursuing justice must balance his passion for justice with the knowledge that injustice will likely continue to exist, that his efforts may fail, and that his failure or success are equally insignificant in the eyes of the cosmos. This creates a subtle detachment from life itself, not a depression or a withdrawal necessarily, but a fundamental emotional distance from what one is doing. The Machiavellian, by contrast, maintains full emotional engagement with the world and with one's objectives. The Machiavellian does not need to tell himself that power is insignificant. He believes power is among the most significant things in existence. He does not need to achieve equanimity about losing his objectives. He simply works to ensure he does not lose them. This produces a different kind of energy, an engagement with the world, a passion for achievement, a fierce commitment to winning and surviving. The Machiavellian can love his ambitions without the Stoic's constant correction that these ambitions do not truly matter. But the Machiavellian path, too, comes with hidden costs. The pursuit of power necessarily involves a relationship to other human beings as potential threats or tools. Trust becomes strategic rather than genuine. Relationships become transactions. The Machiavellian may accumulate power and achieve his objectives, but he does so while maintaining a constant vigilance, a constant defensive posture, a constant readiness to exploit or be exploited. He cannot truly rest because rest means vulnerability. He cannot truly trust because trust means exposure. He achieves external security at the cost of internal peace. Furthermore, the Machiavellian is constantly subject to the very forces he sought to escape through accumulating power. The more power one accumulates, the more people become interested in taking it from you. The more one relies on strategic manipulation, the more it becomes vulnerable to others' superior strategy. The person who has built his entire existence on a foundation of ruthlessness has created a world in which ruthlessness is constantly turned against him. The Machiavellian executive who rises to power through backstabbing must now contend with subordinates willing to backstab him. The Machiavellian who has betrayed others must now remain constantly alert to betrayal from others. He has created the very environment of mutual suspicion and hostility he sought to escape through domination. Marcus encountered both of these truths in his career. The Stoic philosophy he had been studying promised him freedom from the anxiety he felt watching Daniel's manipulative presentation. If he could just accept that the world was full of deception, that this deception said nothing about his worth, that his only concern should be his own integrity, then he could achieve peace. And indeed, when he began to practice this discipline, when he reminded himself that Daniel's success or failure was not his business, that his concern should be only with his own virtue, he did experience a relief. But he also found that this approach left him curiously passive. Other people's deceptions continued to occur around him. The organization continued to reward those who were skillful with selective narratives. Marcus maintained his integrity, but he also found himself passed over for promotions, his ideas not heard, his contributions undervalued. The peace he achieved came at the cost of influence. His invulnerability to external circumstance was purchased by his withdrawal from the arena where external circumstance was determined. Meanwhile, he observed colleagues who had taken a more Machiavellian approach. They, too, achieved their objectives. They rose in the organization, accumulated power and resources, achieved the status they sought. But Marcus noticed something else. They looked tired. Their success was constant, but so was their vigilance. They could not attend a meeting without reading it as a series of moves and countermoves. They could not develop a relationship without assessing its strategic value. The ease with which they had risen through manipulation of others meant that they trusted no one. They had achieved what they wanted, but they were imprisoned by what they had done to achieve it. This observation, that both philosophies achieve their promised destination but in an unexpectedly hollow way, is the beginning of wisdom about the genuine choice one faces. The choice is not between freedom and slavery, between victory and defeat, between security and vulnerability. The choice is between two different kinds of costs, two different kinds of compromises, two different ways of being partly free and partly enslaved. Part 1 continued. The destruction of the weak self. The statement that the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others appears again and again in both philosophical traditions, though each interprets it differently. To understand what this statement truly means requires us to understand what the weak self is and what it means to destroy it. In Stoic philosophy, the weak self is the self enslaved to external things. It is the self that derives its sense of worth from its possessions, its status, its appearance, its relationships, its bodily comfort. The weak self is the self that trembles at the prospect of loss, that craves approval, that fears death, that is emotionally volatile because it depends on unstable external circumstances for its well-being. Epictetus taught his students that they were living as slaves precisely because they were enslaved to the desire for external goods. As long as you care deeply about your reputation, your wealth, your body, you are vulnerable. Someone can threaten any of these, and you will lose your composure, your virtue, your freedom. The destruction of this weak self in Stoic terms means the systematic reorientation of one's desires away from external goods and toward virtue. It means practicing the discipline of desire, learning to want only what is truly good, which is virtue. It means practicing the discipline of assent, refusing to judge that external hardships are truly bad. It means practicing the discipline of choice, focusing entirely on the one thing that is truly within your control, your choices. Through this destruction, the Stoic becomes invulnerable because there is nothing external that can be taken from him that he truly values. The weak self is systematically dismantled through constant philosophical exercise. Marcus Aurelius, in his private notes, practices this discipline by visualizing the deaths of those he loves, by reminding himself of the fragility of his imperial power, by contemplating his own mortality. This is not depression or pessimism. It is hardening himself against the soft attractions of attachment and desire. When he has successfully imagined losing everything that an external observer might think makes his life worth living, he discovers that his true self, his capacity to act justly, to think clearly, to maintain virtue, remains untouched. This discovery is liberating. In Machiavellian philosophy, the weak self is something different, though the destruction of it is equally important. The weak self is the self that is governed by sentiment, by conventional morality, by squeamishness about doing what is necessary. The weak self believes that virtue will be rewarded, that honesty is the best policy, that if you treat others well, they will treat you well in return. The weak self hesitates before acting ruthlessly, questions whether deception is truly necessary, holds back from pursuing power because of moral doubts. The weak self is weak because it has allowed conventional morality to limit its actions. The destruction of this weak self means the systematic dismantling of moral constraints that prevent effective action. It means learning to do whatever is necessary to achieve one's objectives unimpeded by guilt or doubt. It means understanding that conventional morality is a luxury available to the weak, but that the strong cannot be bound by it if they wish to remain strong. Machiavelli tells the prince that he must learn how not to be good, to understand when virtue is a liability rather than an asset. But there is a deeper understanding of this destruction that appears in both traditions, though more explicitly in Stoicism. The weak self is ultimately the self that is divided against itself, that is torn between competing desires and fears, that is constantly anxious about maintaining multiple contrary commitments. The weak self is weak because it is in constant internal conflict. Marcus Aurelius describes this conflict. The part of him that desires comfort conflicts with the part that desires virtue. The part that wants to hold on to power conflicts with the part that knows power is insignificant. The part that wants approval conflicts with the part that knows that caring about approval enslaves him. The weak self is the fractured, divided self, pursuing incompatible objectives, caught between conflicting values. The strong self, whether Stoic or Machiavellian, is ultimately unified. The Stoic strong self has integrated all its desires into the single desire for virtue. The Machiavellian strong self has integrated all its desires into the single desire for power. Both have achieved an internal coherence, an integrity of purpose that the weak self lacks. The weak self wants to be a good person and also wants to win, wants to be honest and also wants success, wants to maintain relationships and also wants to protect itself. These competing desires create the internal tension that is experienced as weakness. This is perhaps the only place where the Stoic and Machiavellian agree most deeply. The price of real strength is the destruction of internal division. Both demand a kind of ruthlessness toward oneself. The Stoic ruthlessly eliminates desires that conflict with virtue. The Machiavellian ruthlessly eliminates moral constraints that conflict with power. Neither allows himself the luxury of maintaining incompatible values. Both, in their own way, simplify the self into something unified, and therefore potent. Marcus, In his observation of both traditions in action around him, began to understand this deeper meaning. The Stoics he knew, the ones who genuinely practiced the philosophy, had achieved something that went beyond mere equanimity. They had achieved a kind of integrity. Their words aligned with their beliefs. Their beliefs aligned with their actions. There was no gap between what they appeared to be and what they actually were. This made them powerful in a different way than the Machiavellian were powerful. Not powerful over others, but powerful in themselves. The Machiavellians, he knew, had also achieved a kind of integrity, but of a different sort. They too had eliminated internal conflict by being ruthlessly honest with themselves about what they wanted and what they were willing to do to get it. But this clarity came at a price. They had to constantly maintain the masks and strategies they had adopted. The internal coherence was there, but it was the coherence of a man wearing an iron suit, unified and strong, but rigid and isolated. The deeper question that emerged from this observation was whether the price of strength, the destruction of the weak self with its conflicting values, necessarily meant destroying something essential in what it means to be human. The weak self is weak, yes, but it is also the self capable of genuine love, genuine friendship, genuine moral community. The self that has conflicting values is also the self capable of growth, of changing its mind, of being influenced by others. The unified self, whether Stoic or Machiavellian, has achieved a kind of strength, but possibly at the cost of a kind of openness to the world. This question would lead Marcus deeper into his inquiry, toward a third possibility that neither tradition quite acknowledged. Part 2. Living in the ruins of philosophy. 5 years into his practice of Stoicism, Marcus sat in his apartment surrounded by books, the works of the ancient masters, the journals of modern practitioners, the secondary literature, analyzing and explaining the philosophy. He had made genuine progress. He had learned to distinguish between what was in his control and what was not. He had experienced the freedom that comes from ceasing to desire external validation. He had faced setbacks, a failed project, a romantic rejection, a health scare, and had maintained his equanimity. By any external measure, he had become more stoic, yet something troubled him. He noticed that his stoicism had begun to function as a mechanism of avoidance. When his father had a stroke, Marcus had counseled himself that his father's health was not his business, that the only business was his virtue, and thus he had maintained his composure while his siblings fell apart in panic and grief. He had been right, in a sense. His panic would not help his father recover, but he noticed that in maintaining his composure, he had also avoided the depth of his grief. He had achieved equanimity at the cost of emotional numbness. When he had been passed over for a promotion in favor of someone he considered less qualified, he had reminded himself that his career trajectory was not his business, that he should focus only on doing his work excellently and with integrity. This had helped him avoid bitter resentment. But it had also meant that he accepted injustice with a kind of indifference that felt increasingly like resignation. He had become invulnerable to disappointment, but he had also become indifferent to whether things went well or went poorly. He continued to work hard, but the passion had drained out of it. The Stoic promise is that by ceasing to care about external things, one becomes free. This is true. But Marcus discovered that this freedom came with an unexpected loneliness. The people he had cared about most no longer recognized him as the same person. His emotional distance, which he experienced as freedom from suffering, appeared to them as coldness. His wife described it one evening. "You've become someone who cannot be hurt, which means you cannot be touched either. You're safe now, but you're also alone." She was not wrong. In destroying his weak self, the self with desires and fears and attachments to external things, he had also destroyed something valuable. The weak self was the self that was vulnerable to love, to grief, to genuine community. The strong self he had cultivated was also a self that related to others with a kind of careful distance, always maintaining the perspective that even his closest relationships were ultimately external things that he should not depend on for his well-being. Around this same time, Marcus observed that something similar was happening in the lives of the Machiavellians he knew. One of his oldest friends, David, had followed a Machiavellian path with impressive success. He had become a senior executive, accumulated substantial wealth, married an impressive woman, and achieved status in his community. Yet, when Marcus spent time with him, he noticed an underlying brittleness. David could not relax in his success because success was constantly vulnerable to those who would scheme against him. He could not open up to anyone because openness meant vulnerability. He could not enjoy what he had achieved because enjoyment meant dropping his guard. Marcus's daughter, who occasionally spent time with David, asked her father why David smiled so little. "He's always looking around," she said, "like he's waiting for someone to attack him." She was right. David's Machiavellian strength was also a kind of imprisonment. He had achieved what he wanted, but the victory was hollow because it could not be genuinely enjoyed. He was constantly at war, not with anyone in particular, but with the world itself, which was full of potential threats. At a dinner party, David spoke about his recent conflict with a business partner. "I got ahead of it," he said with satisfaction. "I saw what he was planning and moved faster. I cut him out before he could cut me out." He had won the battle, but as he described his victory, Marcus heard something underneath the satisfaction, a deep exhaustion. David was tired of winning because winning required constant vigilance. The victory had cost him his sleep and his peace of mind. This observation crystallized a truth that both Stoicism and Machiavellianism had not adequately addressed. Both philosophies promise invulnerability, but they achieve it through different kinds of insulation from life. The Stoic achieves invulnerability by not caring about outcomes. The Machiavellian achieves invulnerability by obsessively controlling outcomes. Both end up isolated from genuine engagement with reality. A deeper examination of the statement, "The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others," reveals that it contains an ambiguity. It can mean that by destroying your weak self, you become so strong that no one can destroy you. This is how the Machiavellian tends to interpret it. Or it can mean that by destroying your weak self, you eliminate the part of you that can be destroyed, so the question of whether others destroy you becomes irrelevant. This is closer to the Stoic interpretation. But there is a third possibility hidden within it. Perhaps what must be destroyed is not the weak self with all its desires and attachments and vulnerabilities, but rather the false self that pretends to be either purely invulnerable or purely strong. The weak self, in this deeper sense, is the self that is not real. It is the self that pretends to be purely rational, as the Stoic often does. It is the self that pretends to have achieved complete freedom from emotion and desire, when in fact the Stoic sage still experiences emotions and desires. He has just changed his relationship to them. Equally, it is the self that pretends to have achieved complete power, as the Machiavellian often does, when in fact the Machiavellian is constantly subject to circumstance and to the actions of others. What if the truth that both philosophies are pointing toward is not found in choosing one or the other, but in recognizing that both represent a kind of evasion of the human condition? The human condition is fundamentally one of limitation and vulnerability. We are vulnerable to loss, to pain, to failure, to misunderstanding. We are also limited in our power. Much of what happens in our lives is beyond our control. The Stoic tries to escape this by ceasing to care about outcomes. The Machiavellian tries to escape this by obsessively controlling outcomes. Both are ultimately fighting against the human condition itself. What if the man who cannot be destroyed by others is simply the man who has accepted that he can be destroyed, that loss and failure and pain are possible, that he has limited power over his circumstances, and yet chooses to live fully despite this knowledge? Not the man who has eliminated his vulnerabilities through ascetic practice or through the accumulation of power, but the man who has looked his vulnerabilities directly in the eye and decided that they are worth the risk. This thought had begun to emerge in Marcus's consciousness as he sat alone in his apartment, surrounded by the philosophical literature that had shaped his life, and felt profoundly disconnected from living. The books had promised him wisdom, and they had delivered it. But wisdom, he was beginning to understand, is not the same as the capacity to live well. One can have all the wisdom in the world and still be isolated from life itself. He thought back to his conversation with his wife. She had asked him, with genuine sadness, whether he had become Stoic or simply dead. The question pierced him because he did not know the answer. He had achieved the equanimity that the Stoics promise, but he had achieved it by a kind of subtle suicide, not the violent destruction of the physical body, but the withdrawal of genuine presence from his relationships, his work, his life. He picked up one of Marcus Aurelius's journals and read a passage he had read many times before. "Very well then, the slave's master can take away his leg, but not his freedom." It was true, but Marcus found himself wondering whether a man whose freedom consisted of his acceptance of the loss of his legs had truly achieved freedom, or simply learned to be content in a prison. The paradox was that both the Stoic and the Machiavellian had built prisons and called them freedom. The Stoic's prison is the prison of detachment from outcomes. The Machiavellian's prison is the prison of endless control and suspicion. The weak self, Marcus began to understand, was not something that could or should be destroyed. The weak self, the self with desires, with attachments, with fears, with loves, is the only self there is. The question is not how to destroy it, but how to relate to it. The question is how to acknowledge that we have vulnerabilities without being enslaved to them, how to pursue our desires without being ruled by them, how to love and to be attached without losing ourselves in the attachments, how to be limited without being disabled by the limitation. This realization led Marcus toward a fourth possibility, one that neither pure Stoicism nor pure Machiavellianism quite captured. It was a possibility that required him to integrate insights from both traditions while transcending the limitations of each. Part 3. The third path, integration and reality. The breakthrough came not from reading but from action. Marcus found himself at a crucial moment in his career when his previous approaches had reached their limits. He was in a meeting discussing a major strategic decision for his company. The dominant voice in the room was advocating for a move that Marcus believed was ethically questionable and strategically short-sighted. In the past, his response would have been one of two extremes. If he was in his Stoic phase, he would have accepted the decision without resistance, reminded himself that the outcome was not his business, and retreated into internal equanimity about his lack of influence. He would have maintained his integrity by not participating in something unethical, but he would have been passive about it. His non-resistance would have been interpreted as acceptance or indifference. If he was in his Machiavellian phase, he would have begun calculating how to undermine the proposal, how to position himself against it in a way that would make him appear reasonable while making the other side appear foolish. He would have been calculating rather than honest. He would have pursued the outcome he wanted, but through manipulation rather than direct engagement. Instead, Marcus found himself doing something different. He spoke directly and clearly about his concerns. He laid out his reasoning, which was based on both ethical considerations and practical business logic. He did not frame his argument in a way designed to make others wrong or to advance his status. He simply said what he actually thought, and then he waited to see what would happen. His own fear arose, the fear of being dismissed, of damaging his standing, of being ineffective. This was his weak self, still present and still active. But instead of ignoring the fear as the Stoic would, or using it as fuel for strategic maneuvering as the Machiavellian would, Marcus acknowledged it and spoke anyway. He felt the anxiety, and he spoke. He remained open to the possibility that he might be wrong, and he spoke. He did not try to control the outcome, and he spoke. Something unexpected happened. His directness and clarity combined with the genuine uncertainty he carried, he was not pretending to have all the answers, created space for others to think more carefully about the proposal. People who had been prepared to follow the dominant opinion began asking questions. By speaking authentically rather than strategically, Marcus had actually created more influence, not less. But more importantly, he had acted with integrity while still engaging fully with the situation. He had not withdrawn into Stoic detachment, and he had not descended into Machiavellian manipulation. He had simply shown up fully as himself. This experience opened his eyes to a possibility that both philosophies had obscured. The real weakness was not in having desires, attachments, fears, and limitations. The real weakness was in denying these realities or in being enslaved to them. True strength was not in transcending human limitation through either detachment or domination, but in accepting limitation while acting authentically within it. The man who destroys his weak self and cannot be destroyed by others, Marcus began to understand, is not the man who has eliminated weakness from his nature. He is the man who has stopped pretending to be something he is not. He is not afraid of his own weakness because he has stopped investing in a false image of strength. He cannot be destroyed by others because there is nothing false about him that others can attack. The Stoic sage achieves this through philosophy and practice, systematically untangling the false beliefs and desires that bind him. The Machiavellian achieves a kind of clarity about what he is willing to do, but this clarity is built on a false foundation, the pretense that one can achieve genuine security through power and control. The real destruction of the weak self, Marcus realized, is the destruction of the pretense that we are not weak. It is the acknowledgement that we are fundamentally vulnerable, limited, and mortal. From this acknowledgement, a genuine strength can emerge, not the strength of invulnerability, but the strength of integrity. This understanding led Marcus to articulate for himself a third path that draws on both traditions while transcending both. It is a path that begins with the Stoic recognition that much is beyond our control, but rather than using this recognition as reason for detachment, uses it as reason for clear-eyed engagement with what is actually in our control. It draws on the Machiavellian recognition that power matters and that action in the world requires skill, but recognizes that the deepest power comes not from manipulation, but from authenticity. The third path begins with three core insights. First, the acceptance of genuine human limitation. We cannot control outcomes. We cannot guarantee results. We cannot make people love us, respect us, or agree with us. We will fail sometimes. We will lose sometimes. We will be misunderstood. We will be alone despite our best efforts to connect. This acceptance is not pessimism, it is clarity, and this clarity is the foundation for everything else. Second, the acceptance of genuine human power. Despite our limitations, we do have the power to act. We have the power to speak truth. We have the power to choose integrity over advantage. We have the power to show up fully and authentically in our relationships, our work, and our communities. This power is not the power to guarantee outcomes, but it is the power to influence them. And unlike the power promised by Machiavellianism, this power is not diminished by being used. It grows through use. Third, the acceptance of genuine human value. We are valuable not because of what we achieve, not because of the power we accumulate, not because of the esteem in which others hold us. We are valuable simply by virtue of being human, by virtue of having consciousness, by virtue of being capable of love and compassion and integrity. This value cannot be added to by success, and it cannot be diminished by failure. This is the deepest insight of Stoicism, but it does not require the renunciation of the world that classical Stoicism sometimes advocates. With these three acceptances as foundation, a different way of living becomes possible. It is a way that does not require the Stoics' withdrawal from the world, or the Machiavellians' descent into manipulation. It is a way that says, I will engage fully with the world, knowing that I have limited power and can fail. I will pursue what I believe is right, knowing that success is not guaranteed. I will open my heart to others, knowing that loss and rejection are possible. And I will do these things not